Are you worried that you might get to an interview and be asked a situational or a behavioral question and not be able to respond? Well, in this video, what I'm going to talk about is how to create an inventory of stories that you can leverage and answer pretty much any question that might be thrown at you. My name is Ivan Lessa, and as an MBA career coach, I've helped a lot of people land their dream job after an MBA. And if you are new to this channel, consider subscribing below and hitting that bell. That way you'll know exactly when I post a new video related to this topic or on my channel just in general. But for today's topic, related to situational questions or behavioral questions, here's what I want to do. First, I wanted to just talk about the fact that you can have multiple stories and you can frame those stories depending on what type of question you are asked. So, for example, you might have a story that would have an angle on leadership, and you might use the same story with an angle on maybe conflict resolution, right? But it all starts with one thing, and that is what I call an inventory of different stories. And with that, the categories in your inventory has to be the following. First, it has to be leadership. And leadership really means not just being a manager and leading people, but it's also being a leader within an organization and leading teams and maybe leading cross-functional projects, right? Leading people from different teams with trying to achieve the same goal. So leadership is number one. The second one is being a team player. So if you had a team and you had to be a good team player, you had to support the team members, what are some of the examples of that? Then the third one is the conflict resolution. So we'll get conflicts, and it's something that we can't really avoid, but rather how do you solve those conflicts so that it's a win-win for both parties? And the last thing is persuasion. We all face situations when we need to persuade people to do something they don't want to do for whatever reason. So let's just recap. The first story that you have to have is on leadership, whether it's leading your team or leading other people that you don't manage. The second one is a conflict resolution. Third one is being a team player. And then lastly, persuading somebody to do something they don't want to do. So those are the categories of stories that you have to have in your inventory. Now, as I pointed out before, you can have one story that could overlap, right? And depending on the question that is asked, you have to really identify, is somebody trying to get to you being how you are a leader, or is somebody trying to get to how well you persuade other people? And depending on that, you can basically shape your story and take a lens of that category. Hope that makes sense. If it does or if it doesn't, leave a comment below and let me know what you think about that. Now, once you have a collection of these stories, here's how to structure those stories. Number one, you have to have a punchline. In that punchline, your goal is to make sure that you have a hook and you grab the attention of the interviewers. So, let's say if it's a story on me being a project manager and, I've had a project that I knew that from the beginning was unrealistic, maybe it's due to the budget or the timeline, I could say something like this. Let me tell you a story about a project that in the beginning seemed unrealistic, but, I've done X, Y, and Z to make it happen, right? So that's an example of a punchline that you should have in the beginning of every story, and it should really be a sentence or maybe two. So the punchline is the first thing. The second thing is that you have to have some sort of context or a situation, and that should take about 20 to 30 seconds, and you should just provide some information on what is kind of the whole scenario or where the story started. So if you take an example of me being a project manager, again, I could say something like this. I was, asked to lead a project that, maybe a director of finance asked me to do, and he asked me to hire consultants. He gave me a very small budget and a very short timeline, right? So something like that maybe takes about 20 to 30 seconds. Then what you want to do is you want to outline a challenge. So in this case, I kind of said that the challenge is that the time frame is unrealistic. I had a low budget, but I might say something that maybe it was hard to really bring other people on board, right? If I want to talk about persuasion, or if somebody asks me a question around persuasion, I might say something like, there are other people within the organization that I need to persuade to do this project with me, and they didn't want to do that, and so I could talk about the challenge that was happening with me not being able to do that. And then the third thing that I have to talk about is, first, kind of what did I think about to solve that problem, to solve that challenge, right? And then I have to outline the 3 steps that I took to be able to do that. And one thing that you have to realize is that when you talk about the 3 steps, and I say 3, I just like to give 3 things because I don't want to give too many and I don't want to give too few, right? So I always just try to have 3 things or 3 steps that I took to solve that challenge. Now, one of the mistakes that people typically do is they say, I've done this, this, and that, and then everything just magically happened. But in reality, we all know that that's not how the world works, right? You try one thing and then maybe it didn't work for the first time, so you have to refine the approach a little bit. So don't make it a perfect situation, and don't say that you're a perfect problem solver. In every one of those steps, keep it concise, but say that initially I tried this, it didn't work for whatever reason, so I had to refine it a little bit, and then ultimately it helped me get a step closer to persuading those people to go on and complete this project with me. So outlining the steps that you took to solve that particular challenge is extremely important. Then the next thing is you have to talk about the result, and it's got to be a positive result, obviously, because you want to emphasize the fact that you didn't stop and you refined your approach until you had a positive result, and that's what makes it a good story. And once you outline the result, the last thing, and that's again one of the mistakes that I see people do, is they don't talk about the lesson that this story gave you and how that lesson really shaped the way you approach these situations afterwards. And it might have that you didn't have to use that lesson again, but it still has to be something that you take into consideration, or you will take into consideration if a similar situation comes again. So again, how did it develop you as a person that now could persuade better, right? So that's just an example for persuasion, and it's an example of how to structure all of your stories. What I would recommend that you do is first, again, categorize your stories from your experience on using those categories, and also think about how you can frame each one of those stories, or maybe one story to multiple categories, right? So it might be the same story for persuasion, and it might be the same story for conflict resolution, depending on the question that you're asked. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, leave a comment below what you think about this. It's really important that I know whether you understand kind of the whole concept, and if not, then hopefully I can answer any questions you have in the comments as well. So again, list those stories based on those categories, and then for each of those stories, create an outline, again, using the things that I mentioned. So the punchline, the situation, what was the challenge, the steps that you took to resolve that challenge, what was the result, and then what was the lesson. So make sure you have an outline for each one of those stories that follows these things. And then lastly, practice. And first, I would recommend practicing, in front of the camera, or maybe just recording your voice. And you want to look for 2 things. One, to make sure that you are being concise and you follow the timeline. The whole story should really take you maybe 2 to 3 minutes, not longer than that. So you want to look at the timeline, or not the timeline, but how long it takes you to really explain that story or tell that story. And then the second thing is you want to make sure that you are concise and to the point. So you don't kind of you don't put a lot of fluff in the story that doesn't really let the interviewer know exactly what he or she needs to know. So, and then lastly, once you record yourself, whether video or audio, I would highly recommend practicing it with maybe your fellow classmate if you are still in school, or maybe somebody else that can give you some feedback around whether this was impactful, or whether you need to refine it a little bit. Now, if you have an opportunity to also do a mock interview, definitely do that and practice those stories. Just ask your interviewers to focus on the behavioral section of the interview, and don't ask for any particular question. Practice choosing one of your stories from the inventory, and then using the lens of the question to really respond to that question with that story. Now, if you don't have anybody to do a mock interview, shoot me an email. It's ivan@mbathink.com. I'll leave that email in the description below, and I'll shoot you a link with a form to apply to work with me, and we can just do a mock interview if you're looking for feedback and you don't have anybody to help you with that mock interview section of your prep. So that's it for today's video. This is the 4th video of the MBA Job Search video series. I've had other 3 videos on my channel as well. And if you want to look for those, I'll leave links to those in the description below as well. And yeah, if you haven't subscribed yet, if this is your first time, definitely subscribe below. Hit the like button if this was useful for you, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.